Day 298 of the Ukrainian war map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine today. And as always, we'll start off with those Russian military losses as we take a look at the exhaustion of the Russian forces there. So in the last 24-hour reporting period, there's been an additional 590 Russian military personnel losses there. And when we take a look at some of the main hardware losses, tanks, 2 losses there, armoured combat vehicles 5 and artillery 1. And then also we'll take a quick look at another end of week captured Russian hardware list that I've created myself here, so captured by the Ukrainian armed forces. Again, this is my own homegrown hobby as I couldn't as yet find it anywhere online in this format. So as you can see, it's been a bit of a decent change in the last week or so for tanks, vehicles and IFVs, so the infantry fighting vehicles there. And as always, this is one big reminder that Russia is potentially Ukraine's biggest arms supplier. Then we'll move back to the map where Belarus is continuing to perform military readiness drills just above the border from Ukraine. And they're even performing some covert troop mobilization as well. And this is all to potentially reattempt the capturing of the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, and doing so in coordination and combination with the Russian forces. Now, if they were to attempt this, they would very likely fail, forcing Lukashenko out of power one way or another sooner or later. But what Russia might be really looking to achieve here, at least, is a military feint. In order to keep a large number of Ukrainian forces to be positioned here at the border, at the northern border of Ukraine, thus disallowing them to be deployed on actual meaningful front lines such as the Donbass or Zaporizia, places where Russia really doesn't want them to go. Then we'll move across on the map, so more specifically in Ukraine now, so Sumi, the Sumi oblast, which of course borders Russia, where Russian forces continue to fire whatever they have available from just above the border into Ukraine. So in the last 24 hours, Russian forces were using grenade launchers, machine guns, and other light weapons to no effect. Probably again to keep additional Ukrainian troop resources at the border. Then we'll move across to the ever-contested Donbass. So where the Ukrainian forces in fact repelled assaults on 20 settlements in the last day throughout the entirety of the Donbass here. And starting more specifically in the north of the Donbass, so Russian sources themselves reported that in the area of Zytlivka, a Russian brigade unit began a disorderly withdrawal without any corresponding order given, having lost centralized control and suffering massive losses in terms of wounded, captured, and killed in action as well. Then we'll move down a bit to the very hotly contested area at the moment, so Bakhmut, where the Russian Wagner PMC units continue to take massive losses with uncoordinated attacks on the southern and eastern sides of Bakhmut, in what really looks to be yet another case of prisoners not making good soldiers. In fact, if we zoom right in here, in the last day we'll see, probably a bit far, so the Ukrainian armed forces pushed back the Ukrainian Wagner PMC units back by a factor of about, where is it? By about 3 blocks. Here we go. So you'll see there when we move back and forth, 3 blocks in the last 24 to 36 hours this one was here. So that's always quite promising to see, pushing back from the easterly front there. Then we'll move a bit more inland here for a moment and take a look at Svitlodarsk. So just got to find that one here. So here it is all the way over here. Now we've got some photos of some cheap cope cones again. are being seen here, set up by the Russian forces. And it seems everywhere these days the Russian forces are preparing to dig themselves in with these useless, cheap concrete barriers. Then in the south of the Donbass, so the AFU continued to repel a whole bunch of attacks on Marinka, which is, right over here, but also Novomikhailivka, which is just south of Marinka there. Okay, then we'll move across to the adjacent Zaporizia oblast. So this is the one that's two-thirds Russian occupied, and there has been spotted some large Russian military columns heading north into Zaporizia from Mariupol, which is technically the very south end of the Donbass there. And this is no doubt to replace the recent massive cannon fodder losses that the Russian forces have been subjected to in just the last week alone in almost the whole front line of the Zaporizia Oblast. Then we'll move across to Kherson because it's not all good news today. Never is it a perfect day. But in the Kherson Oblast here, so Russia continues to shell the Kherson North Bank as part of what I would consider their three-step plan. So step 1, occupy a location. Step 2, get forced out of that location. And then step 3, start shelling that location, that one that you've just lost control of. And then speaking of part 2 there, getting forced out of that location, if we zoom into this more northern region of just below the Dnipro River here, we'll see Nova Kakhovka and Kakhovka there. So you've got a concentration of Russian forces there, as indicated by the Oinky Pigs. And there's some reports that indicate that the Russian occupied units and troops in these locations are at the moment starting to withdraw from here into further back regions. Perhaps in a bid to set up some better defensive lines. And I'll show you some funny ones in just a moment there as well. Then we'll move across to, also in Kherson, is the Zalizny port. So it's hiding all the way over here, where the Ukrainian forces struck a bit of a Russian concentration of troops in that occupied region there. And this was done all through the use of Ukraine's high-precision, long-range HIMARS systems today as well. So it seems like the Russian forces have moved from different locations. So previously at Skidovsk, also at Chaplinka over here near the airfield, other locations here and there, but at the moment they've sort of attempted to mix it up. But the Ukrainian eyes in the sky, that is to say satellites, certainly know where they're going and where they are. And then in terms of some loot, what I used to call loot, so Ukrainian captured hardware in this region. So Ukrainian forces recently found a large abandoned warehouse of ammunition at Snurivka. So this location right here. You might remember Snurivka, in fact, just over a month ago, well maybe about 6 weeks ago now, it was part of the hotly contested front line in the Kherson, or really the Mykolaiv/Kherson region. Technically a Mykolaiv location, that one. So always good to see extra ammo. Then we'll move down to Russian-occupied Crimea for a moment, where, so Russian forces continue to dig trenches on the west coast beaches of occupied Crimea in an attempt to stave off a Ukrainian amphibious assault, like 1944 D-Day and the Normandy land-ins, for instance. I mean, Ukraine will come for Crimea, but it will be a land-based offensive instead. In fact, the United States has recently announced that Ukraine now has the capability to take Crimea back. And as a result of that, the Russian commanders in this region are probably starting to get a little unsettled, thus causing the beaches to look like this. Then we'll move across to some news for today. So Ukraine is setting up 10,000 new additional invincibility centers all throughout Ukraine. So these centers have food, heating, power, charge your mobile or laptop, internet, medical essentials, and other various things to lessen the impact of Russian strikes on Ukraine's critical infrastructure, particularly as the coldest winter period in the country is coming up soon. Now, as current, there are about 4,000 or so of these centers found throughout Ukraine, which is good to see, but it's good to see they're basically tripling that amount. Then in some other news, the Klitschko bridge in Ukraine's capital of Kyiv has now reopened to the public. Now you might remember, in fact, this bridge from Russia's first massive wave of missile attacks on October the 10th this year. Now, don't worry too much about this footage here. Once the dust settles, you'll see that Russia actually just missed it, even though they used one of their KH-101 $13 million high precision missiles in an attempt to take it out. Now the glass panels have been replaced for the public's use and enjoyment again, so always nice to see. Then in some other news, the Russian military commissar Putin, announced that in the near future, Russian conscripts will serve for 1.5 to 2 years, so about 2 years instead, depending on their roles. As just for some context, current Russian conscription is only 12 months in length, so roughly they're looking to double this. Now, this decision has been made in light of the ongoing war. However, it will have zero benefit on Russia's warring aggression in Ukraine. It's not going to matter that it's 24 months, because once this law is enacted shortly, Russia isn't going to wait the 2 years for conscript training to complete. Because the very first week, and probably first day in fact, when a Russian civilian is conscripted to be trained in the military, they are basically as good as mobilized and going into war not long after. There is no circumstance that exists where Russia would wait 12 months or even this new 24-month period before they mobilize these fresh conscripts at all. Then in some other news, Ukrainian President Zelensky announced in his nightly address that Russia only has enough missiles for several more missile strikes or salvos, which sounds pretty accurate because the last Russian wave of missiles on December the 16th was a total of 76 missiles directed at Ukraine, which is less than some of the previous Russian waves and not enough to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. So in other words, Russia is forced to space it out a bit, space out the volume and frequency of these missile strikes. Oh, and also Zelensky went on to say, quote, "No matter what the missile worshippers from Moscow are hoping for, it still won't change the balance of power in this war." Probably quite true as well. Then moving on to another Russian military mobilization blunder. So in this video, we have recently mobilized Russian soldiers that are unhappy with their conditions as they train, quote unquote train, or supposedly train for war. So at the moment, they live in these dugouts, basically, living outside in tents. They complain that they are, that they've only shot twice during training, as he says there, and they really seem to express dislike for their own Russian army as well. So this is an example of the new troops that are still in Russia and haven't made it to the Ukrainian front lines yet. Which I think is interesting because there is concern just generally that Russia is starting to train its troops within its own borders more and more now in this winter period. But in actual fact, or in actual reality here, it still seems to be the age or the same old story here. Mobilized living in poor conditions and still little to no training as well. Then a couple of funnies to round it off with today, guys. So Russian state media propaganda are continuing to put a positive spin on Russian mobilization. So in this advert, down the bottom, it says, quote, "Mobilization cures drug addiction and defeats banditry. These and 7 more reasons to go to the zone." So it's actually kind of like advertising that Russia is sending untrained addicts to war. Or that perhaps the Russian military is designed for some type of rehab instead. But if anything, I'm fairly certain that mobilization will cause more addiction than it cures. Then we'll move across to the second and final funny for the day. And I personally love stuff like this. So in this video, Russia released some footage of Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu supposedly visiting the advanced frontline positions of where Russian troops are deployed in Ukraine right now. And I've got to say, Russian propaganda videos like this always give me a laugh. First of all, it's not actually clear when or where Shoigu is, but you'll even see some scenes of some really fresh, luscious green grass there, which is odd since they're trying to pass this off as a freshly released video during winter. And secondly, Shoigu is not exactly what you would describe as at the location of, quote, advanced frontline positions. He's in fact looking from a distance in a helicopter for the most part, and probably flying over Ukraine as far back as 3 or even 4 defensive lines deep into the rear. Not to mention there's no sign of combat anywhere that he is. And then thirdly, there is just such a high level of worry or discontent on his face. I could do countless memes on this one. I'll just throw up a couple I've got in my mind right now, and I'll pop it up during post-production. But he's got to be thinking, what on earth are we dealing with here? And just lastly, it looks like such a staged and overproduced video, as always with any Russian propaganda videos. All in the attempt to make Russia appear strategically adept, militarily speaking. But it's just so awful. It's really cringe as far as I'm concerned. So thanks for watching, guys. Please leave a comment, subscribe, share if you like. Thanks for all of your support. And I do hope to see all of you guys there again in the next video. Cheers.